Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello and welcome to episode 98 of the podcast. I hope you're all well. I'm soaking up every last second of sun as it doesn't seem to be planning to stay long here in the UK, but oh my God, the difference it makes. I am also about to hop in my car and do the 2-hour drive down to Dorset to see my new goddaughter. I'm so excited. She's not even a week old. I'm going to go and do the ultimate godmothering thing I think you can do, hopefully, which is just cook, clean, do the laundry, hold the baby while you have a nap, hold the baby while you have a bath, that kind of thing that you want as a new mum, I think. I think everyone could do with one. Thank you so much to everyone who sent me messages. I don't know if I sounded like a sad person the other day, but I've had lots of lovely messages from people saying very nice things about me, and I'm British, so I find that very difficult to take. But thank you, I really appreciate it. Today is going to be a quickie because, as I said, I'm about to hop in the car, but it's one that I've wanted to do for ages, and it's something that when I first read about it, I was like, oh, that sounds funny. It's not at all funny. In fact, it's pretty horrendous, and it reminds me of this story that happened about 3 years ago in the UK when this woman found out that her husband had been sexually abusing their daughter, and she boiled up some sugar and some water and carried it upstairs and tipped it all over her husband, killing him. And the reason I know about this, apart from the fact that I'm very interested in true crime, is that she was called Corinna, and that's not a very usual name. And so about 4 people sent it to me saying, saw this and thought of you for so many reasons. And I don't blame her. If you find out that the man, that your husband's been sexually abusing his own children or your children, I would feel like boiling sugared water all over him. But a horrible way to go. And so today's not going to be much better, this story. We are going to Boston, where I've never been, but I'm a big fan of Rizzoli and Isles, the cop show. If you like cop shows, check out Rizzoli and Isles. Set in Boston, I am quite a fan. I love it. I love an easy, gentle cop show, and I feel like Rizzoli and Isles is, it's fairly gross, but you know what I mean. So 1918 was a challenging year for Boston. World War I was still raging, though near to its end, and the city was heavily involved in the war effort, with many of its residents serving in the military and the city's factories producing weapons and other supplies for the war. The war had a significant impact on the daily life in Boston, with food and fuel shortages, rationing and inflation. The city also faced the Spanish flu pandemic, which was spreading rapidly through the world at the time. The pandemic hit Boston particularly hard, with over 5,000 deaths in the city and the surrounding areas. The city's hospitals and medical facilities were overwhelmed, and many public gatherings were cancelled or postponed, preventing the spread of the disease. Sound familiar? By 1919, Boston's population was around 800,000 people. Phenomenal compared to how big it must be now. A major centre for industry, commerce and education. It was the home of 2 world-renowned universities, such as Harvard and Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Boston had long been a major molasses centre and was a major player in the triangular trade dealing in molasses, rum and slaves. Plantations on the English colonies of Jamaica and Barbados would grow the sugar that would be processed into molasses. Then it was shipped to Boston, where local distillers turned it into rum. And then these ships from New England would carry the rum to Africa, which they would trade for slaves. The ships then carried the slaves to the islands, sold them to work on the plantations, and then returned to Boston. See how the triangle works? So ship owners, plantation owners, distillers would make fortunes by the trafficking of people, sugar and rum. This is going to hook into our story. So even after the slave trade finally ended, Boston continued to produce vast quantities of rum. As a result, the distillers needed lots of molasses, and these were stored in large tanks. And at the time, there was no regulation or permits needed or anything like that. Now, World War One ended in November 1918, and Boston was seeing the beginning of a period of social and political change. The year was marked by a series of strikes and protests in 1919, including the famous Boston police strike, which saw police demanding better working conditions, pay, and recognition of their union, the Boston Social Club. However, the police commissioner, Edwin Upton Curtis, refused to negotiate with the union and instead fired the striking officers, which led to widespread disorder, lawlessness, and violence in the city. There was looting, riots, and chaos. But this was happening in September, and the event we're talking about happened right at the start of the year. On the 15th of January 1919, it was 7 degrees Celsius, 45 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty warm for Boston in January. And just after lunchtime, a rusty-looking tank at 529 Commercial Street in the North End area of the city, containing over 2 million gallons of molasses, burst. The force of the rupture caused some buildings to collapse, and the vacuum created immediately after the initial blast destroyed even more buildings, dragged a truck across the street and pulled a train off its tracks. Metal rivets, half an inch thick, were torn apart and flew through the air like shrapnel. Most of them cut the steel girders of an elevated railway. After the explosion came the wave of molasses sweeping through the streets of Boston. Molasses is 1.5 times denser than water and moves as a gravity current. And this meant that the wave got to over 35 feet high in some places. So initially, when I heard about the Great Boston Molasses Flood, I was like, oh, it's a bit sticky, 35 feet of molasses, just, oh. And it travelled of speeds up to 35 miles an hour. It covered people, animals, and anything in its path, leaving a 2 to 3 foot thick layer over everything. The fact that the day was relatively mild for Boston in January probably aided the spread of molasses, which flowed outward for about 2 blocks, but as the temperature dropped at night, it became more viscous. The impact of the flood was devastating. Isaac Yeton was hauling a load of automobile inner tubes into a shed when he had a snap. According to court transcripts, he saw an electric railway car swinging towards him along with bottles and freight boxes. He ran towards the harbour only to be overtaken by a wave of molasses. Amazingly, he survived. He was carried 35 feet before slamming against a door. Injured and completely covered in molasses, he managed to grab a ladder thrown to him by a foreman, who then pulled him out. 21 people were killed and over 150 were injured. 12 horses and uncounted numbers of dogs and cats also died. Many of the victims were crushed by a wave of molasses, while others drowned slowly in the sticky liquid. The flood also caused extensive damage to homes and businesses in the area, and the rescue attempts were really difficult because rescuers and volunteers kept becoming stuck in the molasses and needed to be pulled out themselves. More than 400 people from neighbouring areas helped clear up, taking away the molasses and helping to recover all the bodies and get people out. It would take months. Speculation as to the cause of the flood started immediately, including theories about fermentation that had produced too much pressure inside the tank, with some blaming anarchists for setting off a bomb. The North End area of the city had a population that was about 90% Italian immigrants at the time, so obviously they were the first to be blamed. The city responded very quickly to the disaster, but the initial response was chaotic, as you can imagine. Emergency services were overwhelmed, and it took several days to clear the streets and rescue all the victims. The disaster also led to several lawsuits, as victims and their families sought compensation from the company responsible for the tank. The trial that ensued lasted for years, over 5 years, and gathered input from thousands of expert witnesses. producing 20,000 pages of conflicting testimony. It would turn out that the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, who owned the tank, had been warned that it was leaking, and what they had decided to do was to paint the tank brown so you couldn't see the leaks anymore. They'd also skipped the step during construction where the tank should be filled with water to test for flaws, just so that they could get it in use quicker. Now, this is partly because during the First World War, there was an increased demand for industrial alcohol made from molasses, which they would then sell to be used to make dynamite and other explosives. In April 1925, a state auditor ruled that the company's negligence led to structural failure of the tank. Victims and their families were granted $628,000 in damages. The smell of molasses lingered for decades. More recent research has shown that the tank was designed to hold 2.5 million gallons of liquid, and it measured 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter. But its steel walls, which were about 0.67 inches at the bottom to 0.31 inches at the top, were too thin to support the weight of a full tank of molasses. Obviously, the weight of molasses is going to be different to the weight of water because of the viscosity. The rivets were also not suitable, and it's the rivet holes where the cracks first started to appear. So though the tank had been in use for a while, it was rarely filled to capacity. On the day of the flood, it contained enough molasses to fill 3.5 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So a number of things contributed to the disaster, but really what should be noted is the lack of ethics. There were no tests carried out. Signs all were not well were presented to those in charge, and they decided to overlook it. Civil engineer and professor of Southern Illinois University wrote in a 2015 analysis of the disaster, quote, "When a labourer brought actual shards of steel from the tank's walls to the Treasurer's office as evidence of the potential danger, he replied, 'I don't know what you want me to do. The tank still stands.'" The Boston molasses flood had a lasting impact on the city of Boston. It led to changes in safety regulations and the way that tanks and storage facilities were designed and maintained. The disaster also had a psychological impact on the city, with many residents reporting feelings of anxiety and fear in the years that followed. I'm not surprised. It's one of those things where only the very anxious would anticipate. You know, if you're a very anxious person, I'm constantly driving past things being like, that could just tip over. What happens if a wind turbine just fell over whilst it's still spinning and just churned us all up? I don't think everyone necessarily thinks like that, thank God. But for a tank of molasses to explode and for it to be 30 feet high, a wave of molasses is just terrifying, and so it must make the whole world extra scary. It's still debated as to what exactly happened, but we know that there were a number of factors that contributed to it. Poorly designed, poorly maintained tank, filled beyond its capacity. They hadn't considered molasses versus water, I don't think. The weather at the time was warmer than normal, which they think could have caused the pressure also to build up in the tank. The Boston molasses flood is remembered as one of the worst disasters in Boston history. It's commemorated every year on January the 15th with a ceremony and a moment of silence. It's weird though, because there's this tiny, tiny plaque. So unless you're there on the day, on the 15th of January, you wouldn't necessarily know anything had happened there. But as many historians have commented, it's a huge disaster, but it has led to change. It did mean that everything was tightened up to prevent anything similar happening again. And that is the story of the Boston molasses disaster. It wasn't the lovely Charlie and the Chocolate Factory event I initially thought it was, where people would be leaning out of their windows with apples on sticks and having a lovely time. It sounds absolutely horrendous, and just like, how do you tidy up? Molasses is so sticky. How do you tidy up after that? How do you clear the streets? The property damage must have been immense. So I hope you're all well. I hope you've had a happy Easter, even if you don't celebrate. I mean, discounted chocolate on Tuesday. I always get really cross if anyone buys me Mother's Day flowers. I want Mother's Day flowers the week after, please, when all the beautiful bunches are discounted. It's the same with chocolate. I mean, I want chocolate all the time, but if you don't celebrate Easter, go in on Tuesday, get some cheap chocolate. And please check out the merch. There's Pod Dog merch, there's Monday Night Review hoodies, lots of stuff you can go and have a look at. Send me a message. Let me know if there's a particular case you'd like me to cover. Go and check out the Patreon. There are loads of extra episodes, loads of extra content. Get discount codes on merch. You get my eternal undying love forever, which is got to be worth something, right? And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.